Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you to everyone joining us online and everyone here joining us at the Veterans Hall in Susanville. I'm Sarah Suarez, and I'm the Programming and Operations Manager at Zócalo Public Square. We are a cultural organization based in Los Angeles, and we present free public events, and we publish daily online journalism. We're an Arizona State University media enterprise. At Zócalo, our mission is to connect people to ideas and to each other. Everything we do is free, and everyone is welcome. We publish original writing, as I mentioned, and we present conversations like this one. And you can find us at zocalopublicsquare.org on all the major podcast platforms and on YouTube, where we have a great audience watching us tonight in our interactive live chat. So please subscribe for our latest events. We're really honored to be here in Susanville for tonight's event. What would the end of mass incarceration mean for prison towns? And we're proud to partner with the California Wellness Foundation for this event. It's part of our editorial series on the future of prisons and their neighboring communities as we turn away from mass incarceration in California. You can read those essays and more articles on our website. Our moderator tonight is Keri Blakinger. Keri is a staff writer at the Marshall Project, where she reports on prisons and jails and writes the column Inside Out, which is a collaboration with NBC News. She's also the author of Corrections in Ink, which is out this June. Over to you, Keri.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me. I was thinking about it. I've really spent a lot of time in prison towns over the years. First as a prisoner, I was on the inside, and then as a reporter covering prison towns. So it's really great to be here and be part of this conversation. And my panelists here, I have Alma Beltran, who's the mayor of Parlier. She's the first female Latina to serve as mayor there. And before that was a corrections officer for 13 years. And over here, we have John Eason, who's an associate professor of sociology at University of Wisconsin-Madison and the director of the University of Wisconsin-Madison Justice Lab. He studies health rates, punishment, and he writes about prison towns also. Trevor Albertson is the superintendent and president of Lassen Community College here in Susanville, and he earned his PhD in foreign policy at UC Merced and is the author of Winning Armageddon. So I wanted to start with you. I was wondering if you could just sort of start by laying out the problem, explaining how much Susanville is dependent on the prison as is.
So the big thing you always got to start with in Susanville is there's about 3 stories, all of which compete to explain the same thing. And it's because everybody's got their own version of it. But the reality is of how we get to Susanville, the prison town, is pretty simple. And it goes back to the earliest days of Susanville, when this was still Root County. And the big part of it was that you had a lot of young men here, and that meant you had a lot of labor, and that was why it was a good place to site mills. It was a good place to site agriculture. There was a good reason to do those things here. Not only did things grow well here, not only did you have timber nearby, but you had the people that could do the job. And that was part of what the state understood and studied when they decided, where are we going to site a prison? Where has got distance from major metropolitan areas? Where has relatively small population area around it, small communities around it, but enough young men that are going to be willing to work in these prisons as not necessarily free staff, but as guards for the wage they were paying at the time. And Susanville was one of those places. And in the 1960s, with a fairly conservative turn in some ways in the state of California, cleaning up the mess in Berkeley, as Reagan put it, they began building more prisons. And part of that, too, was because the big banks at the time, got very wise to lobbying the legislature that they needed to get tough on crime. And, oh, by the way, when you get tough on crime, that means come back to us so we can loan you the money to build the prisons. And so this sort of begins this snowball effect. Well, they build the first one here in Susanville. I think it was 65, 66, 67, somewhere in that range. And it was about the time that the first prison, CCC, California Correctional Center, opened that the mills started having a tougher and tougher time. And they began the slow closure rate it ended up in, I think, 2004 or 5, the last mill closes in Susanville. And everybody's always blamed it on environmental regulation. The reality is that the prison simply paid more than the mill, and it was very difficult to get people to want to do mill work when it was easier and more lucrative to do prison work. And the companies recognized that. Did environmental factors have a role? Probably at some point, some level. But it was really population pressure and economic pressure that did it. And so Susanville became very invested in the prisons that are here.
So, you know, as a reporter, I cover prisons a lot. I know that they are, you know, they're bad for like the people that are experiencing incarceration. They're also bad for the people that work there. I mean, in the sense that that's a not great work environment in a lot of ways. You know, in Texas, for instance, they're not air conditioned. That's a pretty strenuous work environment. Right. And, you know, there's always the sort of threat of violence. I mean, it can be extremely stressful. Why do people want to be prison staff? Why do they want to be prison guards?
Well, it's an opportunity for, of course, having a way to be able to have a livelihood and be able to provide for your family. But it also brings you a lot more opportunity for advancement in the prison. You can grow into other departments, you can promote, so there's opportunities that you can seek for more higher pay. It is a very dangerous environment. I do know that. I've been around that. But at the end of the day, it does help a way for you to be able to provide for your family without having to worry about layoffs, having to worry about, oh, well, you know, it's a job security. You know, crime is always going to be there. So you would think, well, that's the reason why I did it. You know, I was working for a nonprofit in the prison before for reentry program. They were talking about disbanding that program and not have it anymore with the state. So then I said, you know what, if I'm here, I already know how it is, might as well just go into the prison, work as a correctional officer, and have job security. I won't have to worry about, oh darn, they're gonna lay me off, I'm not gonna be able to have a job. I have to start all over again and try to figure out what am I gonna do. So to me, it was easier to just say, okay, let's just go through the process, go through the academy, go through all the process that I need to go to be able to provide for my family. Job security is one of the main reasons why I went into that position as a correctional officer. But then once I did that job, you know, it's an environment, yes, it's a dangerous environment, but at the end of the day, you also get to interact a lot with the inmates there as far as talking to them. I know that I've dealt with young kids that come in, they're 18 years old, now that the prison is allowing them to come into the actual prison at 18 years of age. So you kind of try to talk to them, to straighten them out, to do better, to not end up coming back again. I would always talk to the young kids, do you want to be a lifer? So also by helping others, you can also do that work inside without having to be in a nonprofit program. You could still talk to them and kind of, you know, give them encouragement to be able to do better.
Okay. So John, I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit sort of broader historical context in terms of how we got here, how we got to the point of there being so many prison towns in rural areas, how the big buildup of prisons happened nationally.
So we often focus on the cause of how prisons have caused a lot of inequality. What's overlooked in that discussion is how prisons actually are built from inequality. So rural America built about 700 of the 1,000 prisons that have been constructed since 1970. And rural communities that had higher poverty rates and more inequality, especially racial inequality, are more likely to have a prison. States that have higher inequality built more prisons. The other very counterintuitive thing, although we often focus on the role of private prisons or privatization, is the fact that 87% of prisons were built by state and federal authorities. Most of those were built by state departments of corrections. So in a place like California, where a lot of this debate is taking place, about the prison boom, the buildup of prisons, and even prison closures, what's interesting is California isn't even a top 5 prison builder. Oklahoma, for example, has built more prisons than California. A lot of the inequality in the rural South in particular is where the prison boom has taken place. And that's because of disinvestment, underdevelopment, the flight of manufacturing and other shifts in industry, like, for example, big farms. Instead of these family farms, we moved to corporate farming. So that's displaced a lot of people, a lot of workers and the like. What I really focus on in having this conversation is the fact that people are dispossessed by the prison itself, the individuals that churn through the system, but also what we've missed in this discussion is places, and rural places in particular. Many people come from rural America, and we know about this brain drain and this here tonight.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that's interesting about the displacement that you're mentioning is that I think we don't think about it a lot in terms of staff. I think there's sort of a broad assumption that a lot of prison staff have always lived in the town where they're being employed. But I found again and again in writing about prison towns, and it's more true, I think, in some prison systems than others, that a lot of the time the staff are coming from out of town as well. So, I mean, they're displacing people in different directions in different ways. I was also wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sort of time frame of this, because I think that Susanville was built sort of before the big prison buildup, which I think is sort of interesting in terms of how we think about how that influenced how the town sees itself. And I don't know, can you sort of put that in some context?
So Susanville is very atypical. You built a little bit early. The prison was sited here a little bit early before the huge boom, and from which really it starts in the 70s, but explodes in the 80s and through the 90s. The demographics of your town are very different, even over time, even accounting for the large number of people in the census that are incarcerated, the incarcerated persons. You're very atypical in a lot of ways. Also, in terms of your party affiliation for voting and the like in presidential elections, you guys know this, maybe the audience online doesn't know this. You're not just a very Republican county and city, you're like twice you're twice the Republican voting patterns that we see in a lot of towns in California, and this is a very blue state. So this makes the dynamics of what's happened here since your prisons have come, and the probability of at least one of them leaving, even more interesting, right? Given your party affiliation and the fact that Democratic state legislatures are more likely to build prisons, and also Democratic voting counties. I have some papers I'm working on showing this, that Democratic counties, counties that vote Democratic in elections and presidential elections are more likely to build prisons since the 1970s. So you're an outlier in a lot of ways, but you're very typical in other ways. I think that the pattern that we've seen historically with prisons being built and where we're going to go with them, you do fall within the bounds of that, like your mills closing, and whether or not the prisons cause the mills to close is one thing, but we can look at these patterns over a large span of time and see that manufacturing, mining, other types of industry, farming, all as those declined over time, we've sort of replaced those industries with the public works project. And the fact that democratically led legislatures built out prisons, right? It speaks to the public works nature of these projects. This is the great public works project of the last 50 years, right? Since we've done the WPA and other great public works projects, this has been it for rural America since 1970.
So, so Trevor, another question for you. So you talked some about how the prisons came in here in Susanville, but I'm wondering if you can also give a little more of a sense of how dependent the town is on the prisons now.
And it depends who you ask, right? And then, causation, correlation, two very different things. So on the one hand, and I sit around and I talk to the staff in my office on a fair amount about kind of what was Susanville like way back when, like in the 90s, way back when. Not that far long ago, but when we talk about it, there was a more vibrant town here in terms of commercial activity. And it's sort of the story of, I think that at some point there was 2 Basque restaurants, or a Basque restaurant and a steakhouse, and even up at the Pioneer when that was open, they served Basque stew, right? Now you can get none of those things in town, essentially. And it's because there's a certain amount of a demographic shift in terms of what interests certain folks as opposed to what interests long-term folks that have been in the community, tastes, desires, buying patterns. And really, it shakes out like this, is that Susanville, I would argue, is more commercially diverse in the years prior to really High Desert probably opening. And based on what I've been told, what I've learned, annoying people around town when I ask them, hey, tell me about this. Why is it this way here? And a lot of it goes back to a big shift right in that 03 to 06 time frame. And right in the middle of that is really where High Desert opened up and brought with it another influx of folks, not necessarily all from outside the area, but of shifting patterns that went with it, shifting interests, desires. And a few things happened in that. The Army base drastically changed down the road. Its employment patterns changed. There were fewer active duty people now, fewer civilian employees. There are fewer mills. The mills closed in 2005. I think it was the last one, is 2005. And as a result, really, you had this one industry, and so people, you're gravitating where the jobs are. I mean, it's a population pressure ultimately at that point. And with that lifestyle came new desires, interests, and tastes. And it's shifted the town in a way that is less vibrant in a lot of people's opinions, commercially, and even in terms of maybe civic activity.
One of the things that I remember we talked about before this was the impacts that a potential closure would have on the college. Yeah. So Lassen College is the #1 servicer of justice-involved individuals in the state of California, and we even service some out of state as well. And the first thing I always say when I talk about that is how often I lay awake at night saying, is this a good or a bad thing that I am making money essentially for my college off of the fact people are in prison? Yet we still do a good thing by offering education to those that are in prison, right? Ensuring that they have access to education like any human being should. And when the closure of CCC was announced, we sat down with our data folks and my VPs, and I said, okay, basically here's the situation. What do we expect to lose or gain on this? Because we didn't know. We didn't know what was going to happen. And the first thing that we realized was that, well, we're going to lose these 2 full-time programs we got out there. And off the top of the head, that's about 200 full-time enrollments. Now, the next thing we did is, so how do we recoup those, right? So here we are making a business decision based upon how much business we can do in a prison, which in and of itself seems somewhat cold, but at the same time, we're trying to provide education to folks. And we got to the end of this thing, and we figured out we actually didn't really lose anything on it because we just kicked the other colleges out of the other prison because we have exclusive rights in our area to that prison, to access that prison.
because the way the state sets up college districts. So in the end, we've actually seen an increase in enrollments despite the fact that CCC is closing. Overall, the campus is seeing a fall in enrollments, and that's due to COVID. But the one constant has been justice-involved individuals. That has not changed.
So is your enrollment already falling from CCC even though it hasn't closed yet?
CCC, yeah, our enrollment's way off on CCC, and that's largely because a number of the folks that are in there have left. They've been either sent home or sent somewhere else. And my first concern of this is, okay, wait a minute, what's going to happen to my students, right? Because these are folks that are enrolled in a course that are trying to get to something, and multiple motivations. Finish a degree, good credit, I get out a little earlier. I think both of those are good things, and I don't see the conflict between them. But that was our first concern. Where do they go, and what do they get on the other end? And I have to say, that was one where I thought CDCR did a pretty good job working with us to make sure we got them to the next thing, whether that was another college program or one of ours at another institution. Couldn't make it work for everybody, but we did our best. Where I think it has been troubling and really problematic, in specific when it comes to the closure of CCC, is the not knowing. And I know that wears on our folks in town. I know that wears on the folks that work at the institutions. Nobody's asked the question, what's it doing to the people that are living inside that prison? How's it impacting their psyche? And one of the things I really want to see is show me a study of what was the GPA before announcement, after announcement of closure, and then during the process. Because that's a big indicator. Again, causation, correlation, like I said at the outset. But that's the kind of stuff we need to be thinking about.
Okay, one more follow-up for you.
Yeah.
Before, so are you hearing anything? Are you hearing anything from your students as to how they feel about it?
So, not to me directly, though I do go out to the institutions. I go. In fact, I feel safer there than anywhere else, man. Because I'll tell you what, you walk in that yard and you're one of the people bringing them college. You're the coolest dude in the world. And one of the things is I will talk to folks when I'm out there. They're my students. It doesn't matter that you're there or anywhere else. You're my student, right? And the other half of it is when I do talk to them, it's usually about where they want to go and what they want to do next. It's hope, right? You can't. Human spirit is tough to kill. That is the first thing I see every time I go in and visit the prison. The second thing is they want to know when they can get their next class. And then the third thing is, hey, I need some more pencils. Where do I get these things? It's like, okay, we'll figure that out. Now, all that said, what I'm hearing through my deans and my VPs at this point, I think there's some confusion. I think there is concern. And it's tough because when you can't control your own life, how can you control your own education? When you've had most of your rights taken away from you, how can you walk up just at any time when you got a minute to do it to the registrar's office and say, hey, I need to do this? And so while I'm not hearing those complaints directly, I know they're there. They've got to be there. Because I remember what I felt as a student going to school without all this encumbrance. And here I've got students going to school in a prison. Yet they see it as their greatest hope. So I don't know. It's a mixed bag.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. Just sort of one of the things when I was in prison, just the difficulty of getting answers to any questions, like big questions, like is the prison closing, but also like, is this class going to be available in the future? Or even just if you ask what time it is, like sometimes you don't get a straight answer on that. So yeah, I can imagine the way that the uncertainty would impact like how you can plan for your future, which you can only do in such a limited way in prison to begin with, So I was wondering, I know that you've lived in a prison town for a while. So I was wondering if you could sort of talk some about, how prison towns feel about being prison towns, or if you've gotten any sense of that in the places you've lived.
One thing I can say is that I didn't work in Susanville, but Avanall is just like Susanville. It's in an area where really nothing around. It's also had the mills there too. And so a lot of those jobs were created for their community when it was brought to their council. in regards to building an institution there at Avanall. And so majority of the people that live there do work at Avanall. You have like at least 25 to 30%. And the new hires that they get and live in some other town will actually purchase either a house there or rent an apartment there. And that I know because I know that with my coworkers, they would work overtime, so they don't want to drive an hour away, you know, after they work 16 hours. So they would want to have a place to stay so they can feel that, you know, it's safe. I could drive to the apartment, sleep, go back in the morning, work again. So a lot of the jobs that are created with this institution, with this example with Avanall, it was 1,200 jobs at Avanall that it created. And that's with correctional officers was 740, and the other ones were free staff, health, mental health care, the nurses, medical staff. You know, you also have the contractors that do come in that are not directly paid through the state, but are subcontracted through the state, which that's something that I used to do, and provide services for the inmates, for rehabilitation, for reentry programs. You know, that's something that I used to do to prepare them to when they would enter go back to their community. You want them to be successful and be able to be on their own, because a lot of the stuff that now is happening with the massive release of inmates, that is the problem that we have with homelessness. There are at least more than 50%, close to maybe 50% of when my institution, where I was at, that a lot of them were paroling homeless, because a lot of the times you have families that don't want to have anything to do with them, so they don't have the support system. So they go to the community, and if people complained about living conditions in the institution, well, what are the living conditions outside? So I think that the things that we need to focus on, if the closure is due to budgetary or not, I'm not quite sure what's going on, because the mentions of closure had happened even with Avanall. When I was there in 2009 with AB 109, the realignment, the overcrowding, a lot of that was talks about closing Avanall. So to me is like, what is the solution? Instead of closing it, maybe be proactive instead of reactive. And having more programs maybe outside, because all the programs that they offer for the inmates in the institution are inside. And that I can say because I was one of them that provided, reentry programs, like to find them the resources. Where are they gonna stay? Try to find them a shelter, try to find ways to make sure that they're not gonna be on the streets and not have a place to stay. So the jobs that are created are not always just directly for the people in the community, but also it brings like, you're gonna stop at the gas station, you're gonna go to the grocery store, you're gonna go, do business in that community. Even though you may not live there, you still have to, purchase gas, get the gas, and, just all those things have a big weigh in a lot into what comes into that community. If Avanall wouldn't be there, Susanville wouldn't be there the prison wouldn't be there for Susanville, what would be here? You wouldn't have the growth that I see here. There's a lot of growth from what I've seen, from pictures from before and now. And I could tell you that even with Avanall, they had a lot of growth as well. There's more people willing to purchase a home that would never even consider it in the past. So,
I think that what you said about the numbers in terms of prisoners that are homeless getting out, that sounds like that's very atypical about, for Avanall, because I did look up that data, because we talked about this before, and it's actually something like 10 to 15% nationally. So that's very atypical what you're describing, just to be clear.
Oh, yeah.
But also, I did want to sort of push back on the notion that conditions in prisons are better than in the free world, because that's simply not true.
I'm going to actually, you have to, the fact that this is even a debate about the conditions in the free world versus prison, and I'm saying this as someone who has, so 6 out of 10 Americans know someone or has a family member incarcerated. 8 out of 10 African Americans do, right? But there are some communities, I have a paper where I start with this awful joke by Chris Rock, where he talks about the difference between a new jail and an old project, right? And he's saying that conditions outside are they're so bad, they're catching up to conditions inside, right? And he makes, this is a very crude joke, right? When you think about this, how people are living, this was actually one of my respondents in Forest City, where I moved my family. I moved my family to rural Arkansas to write this book, Big House on the Prairie, Rise of the Rural Ghetto and Prison Proliferation. I'm not plugging it to plug it. I'm plugging it because it's a story about rural America. I get like a cup of coffee off of this. So Margie's Book Nook has a couple of copies.
Academic books,
you want,
man.
Yeah. If you want to buy me a cup of coffee, go get the book. But basically, there are residents who are touring the Forest City Federal Correctional Facility before it opens, and they compare it to houses, the housing stock in Forest City, and they say, oh, this place looks great. This is way better than some of the places that we have people living in Forest City, right? So the fact that that's even a debate, right, speaks to the inequality that exists in this country. And if we're going to talk about taking away, just as people who have been incarcerated are precarious and they have a lot of challenges, if we're going to talk about taking away prisons from rural communities that have grown dependent on it, and to back up a lot of what Alma has said, it took me 7 years to get a paper published in the academic journals. They did not like what I was writing because I did an analysis showing that towns that got prisons, when you compared them to towns that were similar, right? The ones that got a prison had better median, they got a rise in their median home value. That backs up a lot of what you're saying. They got a rise in the median family income. They saw a decrease in unemployment, and they also saw a decrease in poverty. So rural people aren't silly, right? They didn't just want prisons for some weird reason, like, you know, they have these dreams of beating people every day or something. I don't think most humans do that, right? We've had these communities become reliant on caging people, and that is a fundamental problem. That is the fundamental problem, because rural communities are actually sending more people to prison now more than ever, and quite separately, so are white people. The whites are going to prison at an all-time high rate. Actually, the disproportionate rate of incarceration has seen a little decrease, the black-white disproportionate rate, because so many white people are going to prison and so many rural communities are suffering this churning, right? So life overall, Keri, not to like push back against you or try and defend, life overall is just hard. That's what the Chris Rock joke is about. When life is so hard, it's catching up. When life on the outside is catching up to what's going on in prison, you know things are bad, right? And homelessness, not just homelessness, but just basically uncertainty, right? So this is, we're at a crossroads. We're going to have to make some tough choices as a country. California is going to have to make some very difficult choices moving forward, right? Because it's not like the prisons here in Susanville are just for people in San Francisco and LA. The people in this community, people in communities like this, are going to prison more and more.
So there was a specific question for you that has come in about why are Democratic areas more likely to build prisons?
So racial composition has a lot to do with this. The subtitle of my book is Rise of the Rural Ghetto and Prison Proliferation. Communities, like I said, this is not a typical prison. I know there's a whole documentary made about you guys. I watched it, Prison Town, USA. I think they didn't do justice they got a lot right in terms of showing the complexity and nuance of your lives, but I think some of the ways they portrayed the town wasn't quite, to be fair at that time, because this is '06. There's the whole way we're talking about prisons. It wasn't quite fair, right? And this is a Republican stronghold. That's the other thing. So Democratic legislators, Democratic state legislatures build prisons. It's a public works project. I'll make that clear. I put that on at the end. Democratically controlled. When a House, Senate, and the governor are democratically controlled, a state is more likely to build a prison. This goes back to the 1970s. This is also because most prisons were built in the South. Texas, for example, opened up 30 prisons in 1994, right? That doesn't, I mean, they're far and away the biggest prison builder, but this was done during Democratic governor's time, right? And this is before the South they were Dixiecrats, and now they're fully Republicans, right? So that explains a lot of it.
Yeah, but the Texas example, I think, doesn't quite fit in some ways, because that was under a Democratic governor, but that was used to attempt to get blue votes in red areas. Like,
Yes.
those were very rural prisons in red areas. So I think that's actually not quite the example on this one.
Well, Texas still, it's a Democratic governor, right?
It was at that point, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a Democratic governor. So there's two levels that this is happening at, and it's different time periods. So it's county patterns of voting for in the presidential election, and then also state party affiliation. Who's in power at the state? It's two different levels that this is happening, but Democrats are proud owners of most of the public works projects in this country. Go back over the history, right, of this country. Those were Democrats who built these public works projects. And I think that's what people are missing. Prisons are, we talk about them being a private thing. Prisons are a public works project first. There's always privatization in the background with everything that goes on. We overuse we talk about privatization too much. The prototypical, the example we always use to talk about private prisons is Angola. That's the state prison at the Louisiana State Prison at Parchment. That's Louisiana State. I'm gonna say it again. Louisiana State Prison is being used to talk about private prisons, right? We have this image of what private prisons and what Democrats versus Republicans is supposed to be conservative Republicans and private prisons. These things, the numbers just don't bear that out.
So we have a few different questions along the same lines here. Some of them are for you, but I think actually all of you could probably answer this. So this question was, how does your research square with Ruth Gilmore's conclusion that towns are, on the balance, not benefited by prisons? But we have a few other questions here about just in general, is it beneficial or detrimental to rural communities to open prisons? So I don't know if you want to take that first, but I'd actually like to hear from— I will let them talk,
because I have—
I was going to say, I'd like to hear from all of you on this one.
2 books on this, so yeah.
So I wasn't always, I'm a recovering political guy, I guess you could say. It's work-related disability. It's covered by the ADA. Can't fire me for it. So thank you. And so here's the thing. One of the things I learned, I worked for a Democratic congressman. I was his aide in a rural area, Dennis Cardoza, down in Central Valley. And I was a senior appointee under Governor Brown. And there's propensity of states that have a certain type of legislation exclusivity or and I'm not saying I am for or against them or for or against the Republicans. Frankly, I'm an anti-Putinist this week, I guess. I don't know. And I'll start that party next week, I guess. I don't know. It's going to be Coors Light, everybody. And I think ultimately that you know, so much of what we have to look at runs back to follow the money. I was an intelligence officer in the Air Force. And when you're going through intelligence school, one of the first things they teach you, besides don't ask any questions, we'll tell you what you need to know, you ask questions later, is follow the money. Always follow the money.
That's what they tell you in your reporting, too.
Well, and in prison, man, like
That too.
these guys are teaching me, man. I'm telling you. But there is some truth in that in politics because, you know, what is becoming increasingly clear in the state of California. It used to be in the state of California from about 1906 till about, let's just say 83, end of Jerry Brown's second term. He was governor when I was born. He was governor when my daughter was born. Go figure. You never get the guy out of there. And what was most interesting is that 1906 to 83 period, the net wealth of those serving in the state senate and the assembly was higher in constant dollars than it is today. There's a problem there. I know everybody says, I want people that are elected that look like me, that act like me, that make the kind of money I make, that represent me. And there's a little problem there because when you hire politicians that need other people's money to get reelected and do the things they want to do and have campaign money left over when they retire that they can then disperse to other things because of the way campaign finance law is written, you have people that are going to do what the money tells them to do. And so it's just a matter of who the unions work with. They typically work with Democrats, at least in this state. And I think that's got a lot to do with it. I really do.
I think you're correct on that. I've heard, you know, sometimes friends say, well, I'm going to vote what's going to protect my paycheck. And so most of the time, you will see, of course, you have seen the endorsements from unions to our governor. So any governor that's running, that makes it, is usually endorsed by big unions that will fund their campaign. So that is one thing. The other thing that you were talking about as far as how it affects the communities, you know, we know about the census. You know, we know that that is one of the things that, you know, helps bring the revenue to small communities. Parlier is a small community. We depend on people to fill out their census so that we can get the funding that we need to be able to run the city. So when you have a prison in a town that is not very populated, but then you have all these inmates, like one example would be, again, where I used to work. When that prison was built, it was a population of 7,000. Then they had the prison. When I was there, they had almost 8,000 inmates.
Wow.
So that was when the whole overcrowding system, you know, trying the AB 109 and releasing inmates and all of that was going on. But those numbers help the cities like Avanall to get the funding that they need for infrastructure, for roads, for any of the maintenance that they need to be able to, you know, successfully run a city. And those come from the county. And when it comes from the county, from federal and state funds, they look at your population. So if you don't have the population, you're not going to get the funding. And, you know, that's what happens when there's a lot of little small towns that are unincorporated. They're at the mercy of a county to be able to fund something for them. I do see that a lot. And so what would happen to cities like Susanville or Avanall, they would probably end up being with not depending on a county to be able to fund them, give them the funding that they need for their infrastructure, for roads, or for whatever may come their way, because they're not going to be the size that they were before.
I think I asked this before when we got sidetracked. Does Avanall see itself as a prison town? Because like some of the prison towns that I report on, like they sort of clearly are, but are a little bit in denial about it. Like,
Avanall is a prison town, and it's just like Susanville. There's really nothing out there. I don't know if you've been in that area, any of you. Yeah. And so there's nothing. There's no way of anyone that may live in Fresno or in another larger city that's maybe 30 minutes away would want to live in Avanall, because if there's nothing there, there's not going to be, you know, you're not going to attract anyone to come and move into Avanall. So that will affect, you know, a lot of the funding with state and federal funds.
So I'm going to politely disagree with you. I've been here 24 hours, and I found a lot in this town. I've driven, I ended up at Eagle Lake. I ended up in the National Forest right outside of town. There's multiple coffee shops. It just may not be something you're used to seeing. So I think these folks have been gracious.
No. Are you saying, no, I'm saying that the growth is here.
No, I'm agreeing with you on the growth. I'm about to get to that.
Oh, okay, I see.
The growth is here. The potential for growth, what they can do with this place in particular, I think is, Susanville is not a typical prison town because the level of infrastructure here is greater than I've seen, and I've been to dozens of towns at this point. With the infrastructure that's here, I think outclasses a lot of these other places. As far as what isn't here, when we count incarcerated persons, the city 14,000, like 2,000 were incarcerated. But I also believe in, getting shoe leather, using shoe leather. So in place, and also 163 facilities. I have that pen you get on Google Maps when you want to go somewhere? I have every prison placed inside of a town and mapped on the U.S., mapped across census data as well. From 1970, I actually have some version of the project that goes back to 1860. But I say all of that to say, we can talk high-minded theory. I can do that too. But at some point, when the rubber meets the road, I'm not talking about causation or correlation. I'm describing a population. I don't have to make these arguments because I have not small n for the academics on stage with me. I have big N, which means population. I'm not even arguing whether this is causation or correlation. I'm saying the things I'm telling you are analysis of a population of every prison ever opened in the U.S.
Data set size.
Data set size.
Yeah,
I have every prison in every U.S. census place, which
you
is
can run a regression on it. It's big enough, right?
Yeah,
right. No, I'm with you on that. And this is the thing. I think John and I actually probably are violently in agreement on a lot of stuff.
Yeah,
because
I know we are.
And I think one of the big things you got to remember about Susanville, not necessarily John, I'm talking about everybody here, everybody's watching, me, is that there's something next. And I think the city, the county, the people that live here, me, have to learn a lesson from the justice-involved folks behind the wall. And this is what I started out with, which was education gives them hope. Mm-hmm. We have to have a reason to have hope in our community. And that is because we got to look and say, what's next, right? So one prison's closing. And again, I said it in the New York Times. What is not to celebrate about closing a prison? There's fewer people in prison. We can reskill the people that need jobs. And I can find economic development money for that. I have a fund. I can. This is stuff we can do. But we also need to look at what, and here we go, you're going to like this one, man. What center of gravity can we draw to this region that creates some pull for people to be here. And my big thing is like, we need a national cemetery, right? There's not one between here and Salt Lake City, Phoenix, Portland. The ones in California on the other side of the mountain, what I call California proper, are near full. The ones in Northern California that are still open are in the last sections they've got. I worked at Vets Affairs for the state as the deputy secretary. These are things I know, right? This isn't just, wild, let's think about it for a minute. And they're not buying more land. They're not making more land in California. They're not buying more land. It's too expensive. Where are you going to grow? Okay, what house are you going to knock down to bury people? And then you look around here, this is a beautiful place. And you guys nailed it, right? We have the right economic, commercial demographic here to support people wanting to come to a cemetery. Hotels, motels, restaurants and coffee shops, gas stations, good roads, and it's a beautiful place with plenty of water to feed the grass. And this is a discussion that I've already had with 2 members of Congress, one Democratic, one Republican. And I think there's interest in it. And I think we have to give ourselves hope again. Because, there's also the issue of, and I think you can learn this from people that are living in prison again, that there has to be something beautiful after something ugly. And I think that's a big thing for folks, is that they want to make something beautiful. And I think that's part of how we misconceive and stereotype people that get involved in the justice system. They want to do good things. They're not bad people. Whose sins are worse than mine? Like, oh yeah, you're worse than me because that's a worse sin than mine. No, that's not how it works. People want to do good things, and I think corporately, culturally, helping Susanville heal from the experience of having a prison and then closing a prison with something like a national cemetery is just, I think, makes sense.
I actually think
I'm crazy.
No. I agree with everything you just said. I knew we were in agreement after I read the New York Times article, but I want to. You guys should understand how you guys feel here in this town. I haven't talked to enough people about this, but I've been across rural America. If you feel like a lot of people in these big cities don't care about you, if you have that sneaking suspicion, you're right. They've told me, right? They've told me to my face when I talk about my research. I've had people tell me to my face when I say, if you want to close prisons, if you want to abolish prisons, you may want to start with decarcerating, but what you're going to need to do that is to give rural communities some options. Yes. And they're like, I've had someone, I don't know, this is PG, so it's not too bad. I had someone quote Gone with the Wind. A younger black guy quoted Gone with the Wind to my face, saying, in the words of Gone with the Wind, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. To my face, when I talked about the importance of investing in rural communities to give them alternatives. If it's a national cemetery, that's great. My question is, what are the other local infrastructures that what's the local infrastructure that's compatible with growth industries, right? So you have to think, so how much investment would it take? So these are things.
You nailed it.
Yeah, so how much investment would it take? And this isn't something you snap your fingers and change overnight. It's going to take the will of the people sitting here. It's going to take the will of your local leaders who want to project a path forward. You have an election coming up. I'm not saying who you should vote for, but I think one of the key questions you may want to ask them is what's the path forward to bring the appropriate assistance to make your community competitive on the world stage in the next century.
There you go. That's it, man, because infrastructure is the question, right?
Yes.
Because that enables everything else. If you don't have a road to get there, you don't have a rail line to move heavy stuff, you don't have an airfield to bring people in fast. We don't have fiber except in this building and my college.
I can tell.
What up? We need to talk about that.
Yeah, where's the internet? That's like, where's your infrastructure? That was the next big thing.
We have about 5 minutes left,
Yeah.
but I wanted to hear from you last. I was hoping that maybe you could talk some, as a mayor of a small town, what sorts of ideas you've had as to what could possibly replace a prison?
Well, that's the question, is like, what does the community want? Have we even considered to hear from them? because I believe that the mayor here is actually has a lawsuit against the governor because he wants to keep the prison. So I'm assuming that they're more in favor of keeping that because of jobs, to create jobs. How are you going to place thousands of jobs? I'm telling you, not just in the institution. You have all these programs that are in the institution and also businesses that hire because of the
Same
volume of
tertiary,
people coming into their business. So how are you going to replace that? And to me, if it was up to me, I would go to my constituents and see what they want for us to fight to keep it here, because honestly, I don't see how you can replace that amount of jobs. It's thousands of jobs.
The biggest concern I have isn't even the closing of the prison. It's the fact that, and I'm not going to blame any real estate agents in the audience right now. I'm kidding. No, he knows I'm not. There are a lot of outside investors buying up some of the nicer homes in town, and then they're sitting vacant. And so the driving population pressure behind that, right? So those are folks that, you have a nice home. The expectation is the people that have the nicer home spend more money in the economy. At least that would seem, why? It makes sense. And
so if
what's
that
happening is
institution
they're
is
all
gone,
getting eaten up by investors who are not occupying the town, right, in the hopes that they're going to make money on it, except for the fact the prison is going, and then those places aren't available to fill it with people that are working and producing, doing something else, taking us to stage next. It becomes like, in an airplane, an incipient spin. It just gets faster and worse as you go.
You go downhill more.
Yeah.
So he's saying in addition
yes,
to the
it will.
institution.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
So the vacancy rate, that's something I found. The
yes,
vacancy
okay.
rate does drive
Yes.
this as well. But you can't go out and get one industry.
Right.
What I'm saying is you need to think about your leadership needs to consider. And I've been preparing for this for the last 20 years. I've collected all this data. I've looked at a lot of case studies. I'm collecting data on repurposing prisons, right? What are the best cases where we've seen where prisons have been repurposed? There's only been 175 closures, right? So we don't have a lot of data on this.
No.
So we can pick some cases that may fit with Susanville or may not, because they're in other parts of the country, like in New York City specifically. That's not gonna be able to teach Susanville a whole lot, right? There's some things you can learn. But I think what has to happen is you have to partner with your mayor, your local colleges, and organizations like the one I work for, right? And I'm not saying this again. Everyone thinks they're carpetbaggers, people coming in to get money or make money or whatever. My wife was born in Leesville, Louisiana. My mom was born in Loveland, Ohio. All of us have family members. My dad was born in Senatobia, Mississippi. We all in this country, even if we claim that we're urban, sophisticated urbanites and have patches on our jackets, we all have rural roots. We all started in a rural place, right? So the passion you hear me speaking about I don't care who you voted for. I don't care about any of those things. If we can't show rural America some respect and give the proper services to help you guys make the best choices. I'm an equity scholar at the Urban Institute, and what we focus on is elevating the debate. So we provide the highest quality research available to get folks, local officials, state officials, to make the best policy choices. And because I've been doing this research for 20 years, and I took 2 planes and then drove for an hour and a half to get here.
You have to sit in the middle seat too, man. I'm telling you like that.
2 planes. 2 planes and drove for an hour and a half to get here.
Wow,
to let you guys know how important you are, right? I left my wife and child and 2 planes, and I got to do it on the other end too, right? This town, you may not always feel like it, but this is why I've traveled this far, right? This town represents rural America. You guys are important. You don't hear that enough. I know the whole rural America thing is we don't need affirmation in that way. Everyone needs affirmation. Everybody can use a hug, right? I'm giving you all a hug right now, whether you want it or not. I'm going to put my mask on in a minute. But I'm available to work with you guys to get a plan together to move Susanville forward.
Yeah, I just
Okay,
wanted to
Alma
say.
wanted one last thing.
Just
and
one
then-
thing to say, you are very important because you are the first rural institution to close, if that happens. The next will be probably Avanall, because I can tell you those conversations had been taken several times years ago when I was there. They were already talking about closing Avanall. So you will be the first institution. So other cities need to see and look at what's happening here, because they might be next. So we need to create jobs, not eliminate jobs. And I understand about the housing and how the conditions are, but that can be fixed. You know, we can't release all these inmates because there is a high increase in crime as well. So because of the mass release. So I just wanted to say that you guys are very important.
Well, that is a whole other conversation. If we're going to start talking about crime rates and releases, like, I'm not even going to touch that because we will never be done. So with that in mind, we can argue about that over.
We will.
I understand that there's some reception with some food, so we can.
Aren't we not
Have
going
that
down to
discussion.
TNA, man? The TNA Lounge? You guys never heard of this place? Oh,
Well-
dude. Hey, let me tell you about this place. Take your
There's
mask for
Q&A?
sure, though.
No, they were sending me questions. If we got Q&A, now we just go down there and argue with each other, apparently.
Okay, that
All right,
works
let's
for
do
me.
it.
All right, well,
All
thank
right.
you guys.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me here. Yeah.
There lived a miner from North Carolina, and his daughter,